Ahead of World Mental Health Day, which happens in about 3 days' time, we're looking at a most unusual book called The Sound of SCH, the true story of a journey with mental illness, told from the perspective of Danielle Lim, who grew up in a family where she witnessed the sufferer of schizophrenia and her mother, who was caregiver to her uncle, who was dealing with the disease all his life from his 20s to the time of his death. Also joining us is Professor Somnath Sengupta, consultant from the Department of General Psychiatry at the Institute of Mental Health. Professor Sengupta and Danielle Lim, welcome to WOW. Thank you for being here. Danielle, let's start with you. The sound of SCH is extremely poetic. It is moving. It's also very generous of you to let so many people into a very personal and what must have been a difficult story for you to tell. Why did you want to share this particular story at this particular time?
Right, thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, this story has actually been with me for a long time. I grew up witnessing my uncle suffering from this illness, and he suffered for 30 years. And I witnessed how lonely it was for him. He had no friends. It was a very, very lonely life. And I witnessed my mom, her difficult role as caregiver for 30 years. I started writing this book a few years back, and I felt there was a need to raise awareness on this illness, and this is a story I wanted to share because it's something I witnessed, and it has been with me actually for a long time. In terms of the title, yes, The Sound of SCH, and a lot of people have asked me, how do you pronounce this, or what is the sound of SCH? Because I witnessed this from a third-party perspective, right? I heard sounds, and so SCH, it stands for a few things to me, right? It stands for schizophrenia, but it's also the sound of my uncle sweeping, because he was a sweeper at the police academy after he had the illness. He was actually a very intelligent person, but after the illness, because he got treatment late, so he actually had to live with relapses of the illness. But there were kind people who actually gave him a job at the police academy. It's also the sound of him walking. He walked a lot during his life. Mm-hmm. So it's various sounds that I was trying to bring out the difficulty as well as the beauty in him living with this very difficult illness.
The first part of the book deals with your mother's recollections of your uncle and his life. And you mentioned that there was sort of a life that he had before the diagnosis and then after the diagnosis, as in you remember being told perhaps that he was extremely intelligent and then moving on after diagnosis to the life of a sweeper. What was the demarcation line between the before and after, so to speak, and how did that happen?
Right. Based on this is of course a time before I was born, right? So what I know about this part of it was what my mom could recall. She was just a teenager at the time, and my uncle was in his 20s. So he was actually doing well. In the 1950s, he actually did well in his, I think it was called the higher school certificate examinations. He qualified for a place in Nanyang University at the time, but he gave up this place to save the money for my mother's education. Subsequently, what really happened, of course, nobody really knows.
In terms of a trigger?
Yes. He was depressed after a traumatic incident. And
this is a relationship.
Yeah, it was
to do with a relationship
problem. Yeah. That's right. And of course, back then the awareness was not very much. So I think it was quite late by the time my mom's parents realized something was wrong, and I think the police had to be called in to take him to the hospital.
We've been speaking in broad strokes about schizophrenia as if everybody understands what it is. But Professor Sengupta, can you share with us what it is, schizophrenia?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Schizophrenia literally means, fractionated mind or fragmented mind. But in scientific terms, I think it is easy to understand in terms of a switchboard or central CPU of a computer, where some stimulus comes in and it's processed and some output goes out. So if you think that our brain is like a very, very high order CPU, and we receive a lot of information from our environment. So the inputs are sorted, interpreted, and some output goes out, and that shows up in our behavior in the social context. So there is a disorder, central dysfunction in the processing system of mind or brain in schizophrenia. And that's why whatever comes in through our five senses, are given a wrong sorting, a wrong interpretation, and whatever goes out is inappropriate. And that's why these people are never understood. How they behave, what they say, how they think, all go haywire. Their thoughts get muddled. Their perceptions or their awareness or viewing the world is also quite anomalous, distorted, and they hold abnormal beliefs. And all these things appear so strange, mysterious, and difficult to really fathom, understand by anybody in the family or around. So this is... Yeah.
Danielle mentioned her uncle before the disease hit, so to speak, and after. Are there triggers for schizophrenia, or is it something that one is born with, so to speak?
No. It's not exactly considered as a developmental disorder, something like your, autism, autistic spectrum disorders, or mental retardation or intellectual disability. It's not. However, there is a strong causal factor of heredity. So people who ultimately go on to develop schizophrenia, they probably are born with a strong genetic vulnerability. Majority of them. And later in life, somewhere around early adult life, around 20s, probably in the face of some psychological stress or following misuse of some psychoactive drugs like commonly cannabis, they manifest the breakdown, first psychotic breakdown, and that is the beginning.
So there is a sense that stress can trigger the genetic switch, so to speak, but schizophrenia has a genetic link. Definitely.
There is a vulnerability, and the vulnerability is the most important factor in the multifactorial causation of schizophrenia. And there are certain types of schizophrenia where there is no triggers at all, and it develops insidiously, which means very gradually and slowly since early adult life, and the prognosis is quite poor in those cases.
Danielle mentioned that with her uncle, he received treatment late. Does early intervention make a difference?
Of course, yes. And there are so many early intervention programs going on around the world, all right? And definitely early
available here in Singapore as well.
Yeah, of course, there is a program called EPIP, which means Early Psychosis Intervention Program, very much active in our institute, all right? So what happens in early intervention is that even before the actual psychotic breakdown takes place, these people are picked up by the intervention groups through their program, and they are given some treatment, usually the treatment with medicine, or maybe some kind of a psychological treatment, all right? And they are followed through. And it has been seen that the decline in function, the erosion of the social skills, and the development of disability is much less with these patients.
Thank you, Professor Sengupta. We'll come back with more from Danielle Lim, author of The Sound of SCH, a book we're shining the spotlight on because we're talking about schizophrenia today in WOW. When we come back, more about how schizophrenia is diagnosed. Does it occur later in men than women? And do men and women require different treatments? Also, more from the book Danielle reads from The Sound of SCH. Stay tuned.
Add to your Wow Factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
We're talking about schizophrenia this evening in WOW, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Good to have your company. Joining me is Danielle Lim. She is author of The Sound of SCH, A Mental Breakdown, A Life Journey. And Professor Somnath Sengupta is consultant at the Department of General Psychiatry at the Institute of Mental Health. Welcome again to my guest. Danielle, could you read an excerpt that will give listeners a sense of the book?
Right. Yes, all right. This excerpt is from a time when, as a child, I watched my uncle, and I was never afraid of him, right? He was never violent. And the scene that I'm just going to share with you is a scene of him reading the newspapers. Okay, so here it goes. As I watch him reading, I wonder what kind of strange illness schizophrenia is. 2 weeks ago, he was deemed a madman. Now here he is, sitting on the sofa and reading the newspapers like any normal adult. I wonder if the neighbors are still gossiping about him, calling him a madman. And I tell myself, maybe someday I will tell them, don't call him a madman. Don't call anyone with schizophrenia a madman, because a madman doesn't sit on the sofa reading the newspapers.
Thanks, Danielle. You know, I think that really gives us a sense of the love that you had for your uncle and the love that so many families dealing with schizophrenia have for their loved ones as well, and dealing with the fear around you all the time, the taboo, the fearful looks, the gossip, because of the perception that schizophrenia is somehow irretrievably linked to violence. Yeah, can you share with us first, before we get into the big question of is schizophrenia always linked to violence, how your uncle's schizophrenia presented itself? Dr. Sengupta gave us a great overview in the first half of the show, but how did your uncle's symptoms present itself?
Right. When my uncle had a relapse of the illness, I remember him having funny actions. You know, he would make funny actions with his hands, something like he was fishing, maybe, you know, with
like a flapping wrist.
Yeah, so in an imaginary fishing rod in his fishing. He would sometimes smile to himself, but when he was doing that, he was just on his own, sitting in a corner in the kitchen by the window, and he didn't disturb anybody. He was just in his own illusory world, right?
Did he talk about auditory voices that he heard?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, so what I recall were just the actions, but he was a very quiet man, so he didn't talk very much about what was going through his mind.
And yet the neighbors feared him.
Yes, I remember him being alone all the time, other than going to work at the police academy. Coming back from work, he would sit at the kitchen window, either reading the newspapers, listening to the radio, or smoking. He smoked a lot, I think, to relieve the loneliness. The
portrait that I get is always in isolation. Professor Sengupta, is there a range of symptoms associated with schizophrenia and how it presents itself? Hallucination comes to the top of mind for most laymen, I think.
Yeah, the symptoms of schizophrenia are quite varied. There are too many, and it all depends on the stage of schizophrenia. Meaning, before acute stage, the acute psychotic breakdown, there is something called a prodromal stage. and at that time the person experiences the world in a distorted way. Many things go on happening in his mind he cannot explain, and he gets more and more perplexed in his mind, and he slowly detaches himself. And then the acute breakdown is a time when he maybe first starts hearing the voices or seeing something along with hearing voices which others do not. And that makes him even more wonder what's happening around him, how his brain actually is tricking him. And then the idea, the beliefs crystallizes as he, in his own way, as I told you, the logic goes haywire, and in his illogical way, he tries to form some kind of conclusions, some inferences, and that is a delusion. And he holds on to these abnormal beliefs. Yes, that neighbor is going to kill me, poison me, or my brother is going to do something to me, something like that. So these are the hallucinations, the delusions, and their emotions gets very restricted, or they may be quite inappropriate in the sense. Yes.
We're moving to a break, though, so if I could just get a general sense of an answer to the question: is schizophrenia always linked to violence?
No, not at all. That's one of the myths about schizophrenia that stigmatizes schizophrenia. Actually.
We're going to come back and uncover more of that myth because it's such an important aspect of our discussion in WOW, or Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Headline News with Will is coming up. Stay tuned.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
My guest this evening is Danielle Lim, author of The Sound of SCH, A Mental Breakdown, A Life Journey. A true story of a journey with mental illness. Danielle talks about the time she grew up witnessing her uncle's struggle with a crippling mental and social disease and her mother's role as a caregiver. Also joining us is Professor Somnath Sengupta, consultant at the Department of General Psychiatry from the Institute of Mental Health. Where we left off at a very important part of our discussion, which was, the question of whether there's always a link between schizophrenia and mental illness. Part of the reason why people are so fearful, I think, when they hear of an individual with schizophrenia is the perception that schizophrenia is necessarily linked with unexpected outbursts and therefore violence. But this is quite a leap, because you say there is not necessarily a link. Yes, Professor?
Yes, I think this is one of the myths. Why there is a hype of this kind of an association, we really do not know, but most likely this is how it has been portrayed, maybe in the media, movies, as well as in some lay literature. But in fact, very few sufferers, they act out violently during the course of their life. And there are, taking the numbers, very few violent schizophrenics actually.
How prevalent is schizophrenia in Singapore as a whole?
It's about 1 in 100. Yeah, 1 in 100, about 1%.
1 in 100. And Danielle, back to the question on violence. You don't remember your uncle Singh being violent at all?
No, he was never violent. When he had relapses of the illness, sometimes he would talk a little bit loudly. But I think that was it. He never hurt anybody. As a child, I was never fearful of him, and he was a very quiet man. He kept to himself, and he really was not violent.
So Uncle Singh, in his 20s, developed schizophrenia, and we know, doctor, that there is a difference between when schizophrenia occurs in women than men.
You mean? There
is a difference. It occurs later for women, right?
Yes. There is approximately a 5 years difference, that it probably begins 5 years earlier in men than in women.
So with Uncle Singh, Danielle's uncle, developing or showing symptoms at 20, is this common?
Yeah, it's quite common. It usually begins early adult life in men, 20 to 30, yes.
And do we know that if this is a lifelong, condition to manage?
In majority of the cases, yes. I think it's about nearly 80% of the cases, schizophrenia is a long-standing disorder. Even if it's treated, still it goes through multiple relapses and full or partial remission, requiring an indefinite length of treatment. Okay. and also support from the caregivers.
Your uncle, Danielle, lived with your grandmother, but who would you say was the primary caregiver?
Well, my grandmother was very old, so they lived together, she and my uncle, and my grandmother would remind him to take his medication every day. But because she was so old, my mother actually was the one who had to take him to Woodbridge Hospital when he had a relapse. She would cook for them and bring food for them. So she was the one who had to take care of him when he was in the hospital, to visit him when he was in the hospital, because my grandmother was really too old by that time.
What impact did this have on your family growing up with an uncle with schizophrenia? What were the costs to your family?
Well, I think my mom bore most of it on her shoulders, and this book is dedicated to my mom as well as my uncle, who has, of course, passed on. So
your mom is still with us?
Yes, my mom she's living with me right now. I think she's listening to this program. So my mom tried to deal with a lot of this on her own. So I tagged along with her when she visited my grandmother and my uncle. But yes, she actually, I think, handled it as much as she could.
You say one thing that's important to you with this book is you hope the message will go out, that recognition of, what caregivers go through and the cost to caregivers is important.
That's right. I think we need to realize that caregiving is not easy, especially for someone who's ill, and because, like Dr. Sengupta says, right, this is a long-standing illness, and my uncle suffered for 30 years. So it's very, very difficult. It's a very, very heavy burden. I think anyone would need support. From what I understand, the support that's available now is much better. So IMH has set up a caregiver support center. They have a job club to help recovering patients get a job.
Was your mom ever part of any sort of circle, caregiver circle? Did she have support there?
No, I don't think there was this kind of initiative back then.
Because, of course, the story is based, it spans 1961 to 1994.
That's right. And, back then there wasn't a caregiver support center. I don't think there were support groups.
And yet, Professor Sengupta, you say the personal touch is key to recovery or to managing schizophrenia.
Yes, of course. Although the medicine is a mainstay of treatment in schizophrenia, but there ultimately has to be some kind of a human contact, whether a patient is in the hospital or in the family. And this is not a philosophical concept anymore. It is now based on research findings that human contact in the lives of these patients really makes a major difference in the journey to the recovery of these patients.
What do we mean by human contact, and what extent, human interaction is important?
Yes, basically, human contact means that there has to be another responsible human being who does not undermine, look down upon the sufferer, because the sufferer is psychotic or not able to really connect emotional way or socially appropriate way with other persons. And some of their languages sometimes do not make sense. So that's not the reason they should be looked down upon, and they should be sort of discriminated socially. So if we can imagine an ideal caregiver who understand this person has a brain disorder which needs long-term treatment like diabetes mellitus does, and at the same time this is not anybody's fault. The person is not to be blamed, and the person himself should be regarded otherwise as a human being. So, and he should be respected because he's a human being and he's suffering. If somebody can really have this kind of a attitude to the sufferer, like in this book the mom had towards her brother, I think I'm talking about that kind of human connection.
Empathy and respect then seems to be
Correct.
very important.
Is very important.
Danielle, can you share with us whether your uncle, because this book spans 1961 to 1994, did he, try different sort of treatments, so to speak, or did he stick to one protocol? What was key to managing schizophrenia for him?
Well, when he had relapses, my mom would have to take him to the hospital.
What did his relapses look like?
I think it's when he was living in his delusionary world, or he would start throwing his things away. He had books and he would start throwing his things away. That's, I think, one of the early signs that maybe there's going to be a relapse coming on.
And did he relapse frequently?
Yes, quite frequently.
Professor Sengupta, you have a point on relapsing?
Yeah, as you said that you were asking about relapses. Just relapse is nothing but a return of the symptom to the extent that the person again is diagnosable as a disorder he's suffering from. That is precisely the definition of a
return of the symptom.
Return of the symptom to the level that the person can be given a diagnosis of schizophrenia again.
So there are points in time where, as you mentioned, he was reading the newspaper, where he is symptom-free.
Yes, that's right. He listened to the radio, he read the newspapers, he had a job sweeping the grounds of the police academy, and quite a lot of the time that was his life, and it was like a normal human being.
And he communicated with you, he was an uncle to you?
Yeah, well, he was a very quiet man, so he didn't talk very much, but, people are quiet. He was a normal person.
Right.
So he came, we remember Chinese New Year reunion dinners. He would come with my grandmother, and we would have a reunion dinner.
When we talk about relapses, though, can a sufferer go through a relapse several times a day or several times a month or in years? What are the gaps like, and does this depend on where you are in the range? Usually
months to years, depending on many factors. The most important factor is the continuation or non-adherence to treatment. If treatment is discontinued, definitely that's a very major point, factor for relapse. Other than that, the next important thing is the family environment. The family environment has to be positive, as I explained to you. Respect, positive regards, all right, not critical and not hostile towards, not dictating terms for the person. Okay, giving the person some kind of a psychological space and room in the family.
Safe space within the own home.
Accepting the person with his odd, strange behavior. Right? Looking at the person from his own perspective. These are very important points. So this kind of an environment is very important for preventing relapse. So, as well as, so this is the second point, other than the continuation of medication. The third important point is abuse of drugs, especially some hallucinogenic drugs and cannabis.
In terms of medication, how does the medication work to help with schizophrenia? And did you see, Danielle, I'll start with you. Did you see a difference between, when he stuck with his regime, your uncle, and when he didn't?
Well, I was very young at the time, so for this part, what I understand about what my mom tells me is that, yes, he had to take daily medication, and yes, at times non-compliant, so if he forgets to take his medicine, yes, that actually could lead to a relapse. And that's why my grandmother actually had to remind him every day to take his medication. But he would complain that the medication is bitter, so I think there were side effects. So most of the time, I think, yes, he would take his medicine.
Professor Sengupta, how does medication help with schizophrenia? What does it actually do?
The medication actually brings about some kind of chemical changes at certain parts of the brain, at certain neurochemical junctions, okay, to where the anomalous kind of a neurotransmission is corrected by these chemical substances, which are the medicines.
Can cognitive therapy help at the same time? Because people think, well, if only the sufferer could, help himself to some extent. Is that at all possible?
Yes, it does. That is one of the other types of treatment which is often used as an adjuvant therapy, which means as a treatment which is combined sometimes with the treatment with medicines when these people fail to respond to medications alone.
Are there interventions? This show is meant to reach out to a female audience. So are there interventions during pregnancy or childbirth that can protect the health of mothers with schizophrenia, Professor Sengupta?
As far as medicines are concerned, there is no difference. In fact, except the first 12 weeks, the first three months, which is a very critical period of pregnancy, the medicine otherwise have to be continued throughout the pregnancy, because they are at risk of relapse due to the hormonal factors as well as due to the psychological stress, social stress they go through during pregnancy, because they are very vulnerable and they are very sensitive, the sufferers with schizophrenia.
But in terms of a gender perspective, men and women do not require different treatment?
No.
No. It's the same treatment?
Yeah.
In terms of what you think, Danielle, could have maybe made the journey with mental illness a little easier for your family. You were young then. Now you have hindsight, and of course you've researched this significantly. What do you think will help sufferers and families experiencing a fraction of what you've gone through?
I think a key problem with this illness is the social stigma. This fear that we talked about, maybe because it's linked to violence.
But it's not linked. We wanted to establish that there is no link.
That's right.
There's unpredictability, I think, that people sometimes fear.
That's right, yeah. But if it's a family member or a neighbor and you've never seen the person violent, there's no reason to think that the person will all of a sudden get violent. So I think what would help is really an understanding of the illness, such that, with some rehabilitation, with treatment. Of course, early treatment is important. My uncle received treatment late. Right, so if with early treatment, with more awareness and understanding of the illness, we could help patients and their families reintegrate back into society. And I think that's important because the illness sets on so early, right? And it's like decades of, it's a very difficult journey through decades if they are not accepted. So I think that's an important thing.
Professor Sengupta, from your perspective, what can we do as a society to help individuals with schizophrenia?
I think most important thing is we have to seek information. We have to educate ourselves more and more and seek information from the right persons. Okay, by that I mean we shouldn't go to the temples and churches to seek information about mental illnesses or neurological conditions. Sorry about that. And also we shouldn't go by what our neighbors say. We can definitely listen to the neighbors if they have a similar experience. So that's first. Second thing, we should not feel alone. We should not think that we are left alone. We should really reach out for help. There are many sources for help available now. Help in the sense care support, okay, for the caregivers. So it is very important to seek support and to develop the right attitude. We have to regard it as an illness, and which can be controlled with definitely treatment. Okay, and for that we should not abandon and we should not curse the person, the human beings.
Powerful words there. Thank you so much to my guest, Danielle Lim, author of The Sound of SCH, and Professor Somnath Sengupta from the Institute of Mental Health. You've been listening to Women of Worth. I'm Michelle Martin. Thanks for your company.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.